Listening to Nina, I tried to come up with a clever formulation for a Finnish symbol type, but I couldn't think of anything, so maybe my co-nationals can help me, but certainly it wouldn't be happy Christianity or goodness, but something rather more cynical and realistic. At this stage in the afternoon, those of you who are struggling to stay awake, I'm afraid I have some bad news, because it will be more about historical remarks to Nina's great presentation. But on the other hand, I will be brief. I don't have a presentation or a PowerPoint, and I don't have a title, but we could call it The Cultural Geopolitics of Nordic Humanism. Or we could call it the historical genesis of the Nordic way of being in the world. So I want to historicize a little bit what Nina was talking about. And I tried to make 4 comments basically. And all of these comments have to do with the way that Nordic humanism interacts with the world. Not always successfully, so I will make some critical remarks as well. Maybe this is coming from the Finnish cynical symbol type. But I think that when we Nordic people hear things that, like you mentioned, that we represent the highest stage in human evolution, it's also, so far, temporary, right? Okay, so we're still doing good. It's a dangerous message to send to young and nationalistic countries like Finland and Norway especially, because it goes right into their heads. And this is my first reflection, that I think that we should be careful about every narrative of Nordic exceptionalism. And I say this not to be cynical, but because I think that very much like Spinoza, that freedom is to know what constrains you. And I think that this is something that constrains Nordic people sometimes when interacting with the world. And let me give you 2 personal and very recent examples. So, a short while ago, I was talking to a professor at an international academic institution, and this person mentioned that there was one group of people that he would rather not work with, and these were Scandinavian doctoral students. And I said, why? And he says that, well, in his experience, these people are very reluctant to step out of their comfort zones and to step out of their frame of reference and the questions that arise from this frame of reference. And the questions, as we heard, they guide also the solutions. So this is one problem with being a model, so to speak. And another very recent example, I was contacted by a research group that wanted to propose a cross-regional collaborative project between the Nordic countries and another region in Europe that doesn't have the same status as a model. And while this project was emphasizing its reciprocal, mutual, cross-regional perspective, all of the questions and every single item in the bibliography came from the Nordic experience. And I think this is a very bad starting point for any cross-regional interactive project. So this is my simple first point, that being celebrated as a model should also make you aware of certain problems having to do with this. But how did this model status come about? And let me try to be a bit more specific and a bit more historical about this, about the problematic sometimes of the Nordic model in terms of being translated into some form of moral imperialism. I think this has a geopolitical background. In a sense, it was a strategy also from some of the Nordic countries. And I think that the historically formed relationship between politics and culture that Nina touched upon, especially in the article that you sent to me before, is very interesting and is crucial for understanding the way the Nordic model came into being and the way it relates to other parts of the world. And we can even point to some certain specific dates that are very important. In the 19th century, which is the formative century for this model, in my view at least, and So 1809, when Sweden loses Finland to Russia, and 1814, of course, when Denmark loses or starts losing Norway because it was a long process. And then especially 1864, which was the defeat of Denmark in a Danish-Prussian war. And there were two things that happened in 1864, which deserve to be highlighted in my mind in this context. And the first was that before there had been a very strong movement of political Scandinavianism that failed to materialize in support of Denmark in this war, which was experienced as a huge defeat and a failure of Scandinavianism. After which this political enthusiasm translated into culture. So political Scandinavianism became a cultural project. And this is a major historical background for Nordic humanism in the world, I think. Because it was conceptualized like this, that we should go into Europe, into the world, and promote European culture, promote Ibsen, Björnson, Strindberg on European and global book markets. And one of the people, symbolically also, this was the year when Ibsen left Norway, right, for 3 decades. And one of the people, or the most important person in this project was Georg Brandes, the Danish intellectual and cultural mediator, since we've been talking about mediators today. A very important person who started thinking in terms of trying to, as he phrased it, reconquer within the boundaries of our nation that which is lost externally. So trying to compensate for military and political loss by becoming a great cultural nation, and most of all by becoming a model society for the world. So already in the late 19th century, Brandes has this idea that we should try to position ourselves on international arenas by figuring as a model in terms of education, of social welfare, and so forth. And Sweden, of course, further developed even more successfully this idea of being a model, which then sometimes translated into moral imperialism as its less flattering consequences. So I say this basically to underline that it's a very complicated and complex relationship between politics and culture, and you can't really separate them. They're part of the same story. But if there is a problem of moral imperialism, and this brings me to my third point, then what can we do about this? Well, if we look beyond the Nordic model and try to highlight some intra-Nordic tensions and differences, maybe we can trace another kind of Nordic humanism that develops outside of the Danish-Swedish core of Scandinavia in Norway and Finland. As you know, we have our little power geometries also within Norden. And I find that often in the scholarly and cultural debates in the 19th and 20th century, you have a lot of criticism against these former urban centers of the former empires, Denmark and Sweden. So a criticism of Stockholm and Copenhagen as intellectual milieus that are very universalistic, but also somehow provincial in being blind to what happens elsewhere. Of course, this is a familiar critique against all metropolitan centers, but it translates into culture very much from a Finnish and Norwegian point of view. So you have the last slide you showed about Georg Henrik von Wright, the Finnish philosopher. He wrote an article in the 1970s, an overview of Scandinavian and Finnish philosophy, where he tried to argue that there is a problem in Swedish philosophy in the sense that it's somehow provincial, and this provincialism comes from closing yourself too much within your own boundaries, whereas the Finnish and Norwegian philosophers, according to Georg Henrik von Wright, were much more reflexive and open-minded and internationally curious. By necessity, you could say. They couldn't afford to be universalistic. And of course, we can see this also a kind of strategic move to try to to make a virtue of being a bit backward in a way. And this is what a kind of a project that they were doing in a way, that to draw on this kind of advantage of backwardness, which is a concept sometimes evoked in economic history, especially with respect to Japan, that you can make the most out of being backward by learning from not only the models but also the mistakes made by others that are perceived of as being more advanced, and Japan is usually the paradigmatic example. Much else could be said about von Bricht, who is a kind of Finnish parallel to Arne Næss in Norway, also as an ecological thinker. But let me end with a final remark on the question of scale, of scholarly scales, but also the scales for social organization that are currently being redefined. So Nordic humanism, as you describe it, is very much part of the nation-state era, of course. And my question, very open question, is that what if the current renationalization of European societies, what if this is only the last and desperate expression of this form, which may have become out of tune with modern life, with modern capitalism, with ecological threats? So what if we're going back to the pre-nation-state era of networks, of interconnected networks with urban centers as their nodes? This is important to reconsider in relation to Nordic humanism, because all of the people that we've been talking about are very firmly rooted in national enlightenment. And if we're now approaching another kind of world, what kind of rethinking of narratives of Nordic humanism do we need for this possible future? Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. And now it's time for discussion and questions. Yes, please. Just a second, you get the microphone, and then we'll have Sakari. Yeah.
Great session, and more connections that I didn't anticipate, not just in terms of relational thinking, but in terms of complexity theory, emergence theory. So first, on the evolutionary biology, I guess we should start with that. So at Bryn Mawr College, where I taught for a long time, I was in an interdisciplinary group on emergence as an alternative to evolutionary biology. So less teleological, it's bottom-up, knowledge is emergent, it comes out of dynamic exchanges, there's a lot of affinity with complexity theory. So the alternative institute would be the Santa Fe Institute that looks at these things. And so it's a different kind of ecological thinking that's less teleological, so there's less some end state that is already anticipated. And so the idea that a society might evolve in an emergent bottom-up way it's less judgmental as to whether it's actually going to be better or not. So that, I think, relates a little bit to another political scientist, Robert Axelrod from Michigan, who revised evolutionary thinking through his computer models, which suggested that it wasn't really necessary to see it strictly in terms of competition, but also cooperation. Again, I think another way of spinning your very eloquent and I think convincing theorization of how to look at these things. Axelrod's theory was called tit for tat, which is people have a natural tendency to cooperate until that trust is betrayed, and then they compete. And I don't know to what extent Eleanor and Charles Ostrom were influenced by Axelrod, though I knew they were familiar with his work. And the last thing I want to add is that they were on the editorial board of Publius, the Journal of Federalism, when I was the annual review editor, and I got to know them and their work quite a bit. And I became interested in these ideas of decentralization and the federation, or what Aruna Padarai calls the federation of federations. And I do think that this is very important work that can point the way to how maybe Nordic countries do have something more to offer than just the welfare state. So I really, really was appreciative of all that.
Thank you very much, and your connection with Axel definitely is there. I know was very much.
So, you have to use the microphone, and shall we?
Yeah, just a short comment. What I've forgotten to mention is something that we are is a term that we are forging in our book, meaning the competitive advantage of collaboration. Because we are not talking about collaboration as a kind of starry-eyed project. We are talking collaboration in the world of brutal competition. However, there is a premise for the competitive advantage of collaboration, in the sense that, yes, as Wilson says, that the selfishness beats altruism within groups, but altruist groups like the Nordic groups beat competitive selfish groups with regard to quality of life. And this is actually the proof of the eating is in the pudding. If you look at the empirical basis and empirical, and indexes and so on, they are there on the top consistently, however you take it. So they do represent this competitive advantage of collaboration. And this does not mean at all that there is a teleology about it, as you say. So far, they've been very lucky, and they've been very consistent. But it doesn't mean at all that they are not fragile. So we all presume that they are vulnerable.
Okay. We have Sakari and then Eilo asking for. Sakari already has a microphone.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much for a very wonderful presentation. First thing was that I was very taken by your reference to Ostrom. Of course, now there is this discussion in economics by Samuel Bowles and Harvard Kintis on economics of cooperation and of reciprocity and this kind of. But one interesting where I don't want to go is that I think that already in the Stockholm School of Economics, way back in the 20s, there are very many interesting kind of like articulations on this kind of like the question of cooperation and competition, kind of like it's a long story, but I think that the Stockholm School of Economics in many ways was a pioneer also in this with risk and uncertainty, this kind of like etc. But I come to that. I think that this idea of cooperation and competition, it's a very classic one. That's what Immanuel Kant called asocial sociality, and which Rousseau, when he wrote about in his original language, and he used some metaphors, kind of like that. There are some people that come by the fire, but then there are others that go away, and this is a classic political question: how to combine this kind of like cooperation, competition by way. So my question actually is that what is this particular in the Nordic way in this balancing act? Personally, I'm a political scientist. I think that it's very much concerned with the democracy and this kind of like the relations and social relations that are able to mediate it. But in the Nordic case, it's much more, I mean, like this has been articulated in different disciplines in many ways. Let's take, when you say the pastoral enlightenment, it comes, the person that comes to my mind is Anders Nygård and the Lund theology. It's got the book Agape or Eros, which means agape is sociality and eros is competition or personal eros. And so my kind of like this is a question, not just a comment in a sense that how do you see this balancing? Kind of like, have you something more to say about the balancing act, because I would read, if you take this, I think also that these groups of particular intellectuals have been very, very influential in the Nordic ways. I could say, I come back tomorrow to that Axel Hegerström, for instance. I could take some passages from him where he kind of like attacks and criticizes some metaphysical kind of positions, especially from the same kind of point of view, and criticizes Kelsen and etc. So this is, I just think that this is a very important point. From my point of view, and here is Åström, I think that the real strength of the Nordic way is the conflict resolution. That it is able, it has fine procedures and democratic procedures how to solve contradictions and regulate conflicts in a very peaceful manner. And Dag Hammarskjöld, for instance, was here a very important figure in also from this transnational sense. But yeah, interesting.
Thank you, Sakari. And then Eilo.
Thank you. It was really, really interesting, Nina. Thank you. I also thought it was so, was it Steinar or, yes, it was so fascinating to listen to you following Nina, because you were in so many ways confirming the founding traditions of Scandinavia. One of the words that I was looking for, but I didn't find actually there, was humbleness. Yeah, you should not brag about what you are. It's such a strong part of, you know, the Nordic identity. And you totally proved that when you went up there with your comments. So, I have a paper here that I didn't actually mention or quote it in my speech, which Lars Calmfors wrote for a workshop here in Helsinki for 2013. And what I always thought was so interesting in that paper, he was talking about is it okay that I call you Sandy? Everybody else is doing that. When you look at the Nordic model, you imagine that there's such a big part of it is the social and the health services, the redistribution of funds between, you know, people. But he's pointing out that a lot of other countries have a much higher level of redistribution than the Nordic countries do, because we have such a high level of labor participation, hard work, as you were mentioning. And we think it's so important to work hard. And we think it's also, a few months ago, we actually in Iceland, we got, which is not maybe humble to mention, but we got the first seat, again, in an index, which had to do with being the most altruistic nation. And Icelanders were furious about that. You know, they said we shouldn't be the first place and complained about everything about that. But when you looked at it, it was actually, what they were saying is that the altruism was in the way that you work hard, you pay your taxes to help the ones that need it, rather than saying that you always need to get more for yourself. And the fairness concept, as you mentioned it, is such an important part of the Nordic identity. And I think that's so important to keep that in mind, that the Nordic welfare model is based on hard work, growth, welfare, not the other way around. And it just seems to be a huge misconception often in the discussion when people talk about the Nordic countries. And our individualism is also a big part of who we are. In Iceland, yes, we're trying to collaborate, but we argue about everything. And we're the people that sailed away from Norway. You know, we didn't want to, because they were wanted to have one king and they wanted to cooperate, and we left. Okay, so it's just so many things that you mentioned. You know, the pastoral traditions is. I totally agree with you. Is such a big part of who we think we are. But we don't like to brag about it. And please, let's continue to not do that.
Thank you, Eilo. I think that the idea I got here, yes, just that the humbleness might be the Finnish symbotype. There are many writers that can confirm that. And then we have a comment from Oti.
Hello. I think this is a comment that actually Stefan already raised in his commentary, but I would like to hear the answer. What do you think, Nina, about this? When you mentioned the Ostrom's principles of sustainable community, and the first one was defining clear group identity and boundaries. Like, how do you relate that to our actual times when you think of the immigration, the people that are, and this constant movement that is not going to end? So what happens if we define clear group identities and also strong boundaries? How are we able to include the people who come from outside, or would you see it as that they have to define their own group identities and their own boundaries, and they have to be in their own little groups? Or what happens when we receive as a society newcomers who have not been living in a Nordic country all their life? How do you see it?
We were actually discussing this question because this is one of the very neuralgic issues in this building a new community with the and incorporating guests as part of this inclusive community, because building a inclusive community is the strength of the Scandinavian model, you know, for a very long time. So include everybody. And one of the suggestions have been changing the way in which the refugees are taking in or are being accepted in a community. They are usually accepted by a bureaucratic apparatus, which is in a sense alienating more than it should. They should be actually accepted by people who are trying already from point zero, create this inclusive identity and coach the newcomers in, you know, here we do it in this way, and here you just follow me and I'll show you how, you know, how it's done here, and so on, and you feel included and you feel innocent. In other words, there have to be the receivers who are both teachers, educators, and members of the community, which you know, already established in a country of which is the host. So, in other words, when your Iraqis or your Afghans come, they should be met by a special committee, a subgroup consisting of the Norwegians, the Iraqis, the Afghans, and you know, teachers, intellectuals, and educators and social workers, who in a sense function as a subgroup, as a receiving group, rather than this anonymous. In other words, the people are supposed to be submitted to another small group that is introducing the community of newcomers into the bigger group, which then is Norway or Finland. Without the contact with this small subgroup, which initiates the newcomers into the ways and, you know, the habits of the heart and habits of the minds of the community, and only relying on the bureaucratic apparatus and a certain kind of alienating welfare structure, is actually creating more problem than profit in the whole thing. You know, so that was one of the. That was the last discussion we had, and that was the last conclusion we arrived at. But we are still working on it. We haven't actually come up with a silver bullet solution, to be quite frank. We only know that the whole process of receiving the refugee communities is based on misconceptions, on a mixture of business and bureaucracy, which is alienating these newcomers more than making them part of an inclusive community.
Yes, thank you. Basically, Nina, yeah. Microphone, please. Microphone.
There are two models that you could look into. One is the Canadian system, where you can sponsor, like organizations or individuals. At least 10 can sponsor a refugee. So they actually take them in and provide for them for a year. And in Iceland, we have families that almost like 5 families for one family of refugees that helps them for 2 years after they come. And we haven't done so much, but at least this has worked really well.
Yes, and I would like to add to that at least in Finland we have the Grundtvigian tradition of non-formal education, a whole system that is financed, Medborgarinstitut in Swedish, that is free for everybody. It's not formal education, and there are several groups. And this is a very old tradition we have. I think it's basically functioning in every Nordic country. So yes, but there was, Pierre was asking, do we have a microphone somewhere?
In the discussion, 2 things has been neglected about seeking this cultural root. One thing when I have been giving talks and discussed about social and so forth.
Microphone.
In other countries, then it's not like that. I have met a lot of people who are waiting for getting acceptance to act as social actors, where I think it's in my birthright to take action and become a social actor. I don't know where it comes from. I sometimes think it comes from our family's story starts this way. We were the first free farmers in Jutland, right? Which is a signal. We have the right to act. We don't obey. That is one thing. The other one is every time I read something about what the Nordic countries have done, they always mention the bumblebee. And collective action is to create a bumblebee, something which you didn't think was possible, right? So the challenge that sometimes somebody has said that this is not possible. But if you create a small community, a small, newly established common, then you can get any bumblebee flying. So this trust, I think we are given in birth gift, at least as happy Christian Danes.
Thank you, Pierre. More comments, questions, remarks? Yes, please. Just a microphone.
Oh, here we go. Okay. Yeah, no, just to make a connection of the connections, I guess, which I'm so impressed that the conference has these connections, is that this kind of thinking relates to this whole relational approach. So I'm thinking here of the pragmatists and their interest in pluralism, especially as represented by not just William James, but also Jane Addams in Hull House, which is a settlement community for helping newcomers adapt to the new nation that they were seeking in the United States and becoming members of in Chicago. And settlement is historically in the Western world a way of doing this. But the way Addams conceived of it, it was a more pragmatic approach, a bottom-up approach that was willing to compromise. She very much was trying to counter the idea that change would occur through conflict. She saw it occurring through cooperation. She also thought that democracy was more about relationships rather than rights, and that what newcomers needed to be educated on was how to be in relation with their host country and vice versa, rather than how to assert rights as individuals in that sense. And that was highly gendered for her. I mean, she never identified herself, but Addams, as someone who was close to Dewey and James, was a pluralistic pragmatist who was probably a socialist feminist. She wasn't really into labels. And she saw this in highly gendered terms, that what we should be doing, our civics should be about teaching people how to learn democratic relationships and to be a good democratic citizen was to honor your relationship to what she called her cosmopolitan neighbors. And so she saw pluralism as a way of strengthening rather than undermining community. And I do think that this is a challenge for the Nordic countries today in our globalizing world.
Thank you. More comments? Questions? Then I thank you for this fantastic afternoon and also the morning. I'm not going to do any repeating what has been said here today because it's very late in the afternoon and there are so many ideas and comments that are sort of linking, as you said, to each other, so that I'm really impressed that all your presentation make a sort of a wholeness, and there are very good practical remarks. What should we do in order? I mean, Anita's presentation where you said that data is not adequate enough to follow the gender perspective. I'm so glad that we had you here, Elo, with your personal experience as a politician added to this conference. And Sandy, so many thanks for this morning. Stefan, Nina, and who else? I'm forgetting somebody. All you are having. Joel, yes. Your comments to Sandy were very, very accurate. We'll continue tomorrow.